In this tutorial, you're going to be learning how to make an applique felt square. So materials and equipment you'll need a felt square, colour of your choice, or you could have several colours, felt scraps, embroidery thread and needle, a needle threader, embroidery scissors if you have them, and then any additional embellishments you might want to add. An example of embellishment is buttons or ribbons. You're going to use a letter for your applique fabric square. So you could use the first letter of your first name, or if you're making this as a gift for someone, perhaps the first letter of their name. Now it's always going to be a lot easier for yourself if you are able to print out a letter bold and big enough for you to work from, rather than try and draw it by hand, unless you're particularly good at font writing. So you can create yourself a paper template first of all, and then what you want to use is some dressmaking pins to hold the paper template in place on your fabric before you cut it out. Now always try and work from the edges of the fabric. If you try to do this from the middle of the fabric, it will still work, but what that means is you're wasting a lot of the fabric. So by always pinning pieces like this right to the edges, you are utilising your fabric more and you'll be able to get more use out of it. So you can see our learner here is just putting the dressmaking pins through the paper and the fabric, and then back out on the other side again. And this will hold that piece of paper in place so that she can then cut out the letter E. Now the reason we do this rather than draw and stay straight onto fabric is because if you draw with a marker pen, for example, straight onto the fabric and you make a mistake, you've damaged some of that fabric. So this again is a way of utilising your fabric and saving it. So once you've pinned it in place, especially with felt, you can use just standard scissors to cut out felt most of the time. You don't need special fabric shears. You can then remove the pins and the paper, and then you want to consider what colour fabric you want to place your applique on. So you could, if you've got a pack of felt like this, you could just do like our learner has here, just lay it against and look at what works well, what colours do you think work well together. You don't want two colours very similar because they won't stand out against one another, so you want contrasting colours wherever possible. And then it's time for us to actually start sewing everything on. So this is where you apply what you learned from previous tutorials using the stitches that you're comfortable with to sew your applique design onto your felt square. And you can even think, like the learner has here, about contrasting colours with your threads as well. If you've got choices of colours with your embroidery threads, maybe think about what colours work well with your felt. So same again, you're pinning the fabric together rather than gluing it or sticking it, so that it holds it in place, ready for you to sew it on. Don't forget everything you learned in the previous tutorial. Remember to anchor on at the back, and then think about what stitches you're going to use to sew your letter on, what's going to look decorative, and remember to make sure they're evenly spaced and nice and neat. So some of these stitches are functioning in the sense that they're making sure that the letter stays attached to the fabric, and some are decorative as well. So our learner's just adding in another running stitch in the centre of a letter just for further decoration. And there's nothing to stop you from doing further stitches elsewhere on your fabric square. So if you wanted to just almost draw patterns with your embroidery thread, then you can do that. It's another good way of adding extra additional detail to your product. Now applique is a French word and it literally means to put on. So here the applique is the letter E being applied onto the felt square. You might see examples of it on your clothing or other textile products at home. Have a look out for it. See if you can find and identify other examples of applique in your home. Don't forget as well to anchor off once you've finished with each piece of embroidery thread. If you don't do this over time, your stitches will unravel. So it's just as important to anchor off as it is to anchor on at the start of your threading. And then when you're happy with your applique, you might want to consider other embellishments. And embellishments is just a fancy word for additional decoration, really. So buttons is a really good example of an embellishment, something that we often see in textile items. And it can be used to function, to help us do up clothes, or it can just be decorative. It could just be there as a bit of extra decoration. Again, think about the placement and think about the colours you're using. So our learner here is sticking mostly with primary colours, so we've got blue, reds and yellows. Other examples of embellishments are ribbon and trim, sequins and beads. You might already have a stash of crafty items like this that you can add on to your applique. And just as with the stitching, if you're sewing on embellishments, remember to anchor on and off again, because otherwise, especially with items such as buttons that are a little bit heavier, they will fall off over time if you haven't done this. So now it's your turn to make your applique design. Remember, as always, the most important thing is to have as much fun with this as possible.